and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another Florida Amazing 10. Today I'm taking a look at a group of interesting monuments and memorials in the Sunshine State. We have a large number of roadside memorials from the Panhandle to the Keys. So many, in fact, I think many people don't take much notice of them. That's a shame, because they tell hundreds of stories of Florida's history, from the arrival of Paleo-Americans some 14,000 years ago, to the 15th century arrival of Europeans, the 19th century arrival of U.S. settlers, and up to the activities of Floridians in the recent past. There's not much that links the 10 I've chosen to cover today, other than each has a connection with tourism, and are less well known as they should be. They span all of Florida's human history and tell of the contributions of people born here, as well as those who used their talents to make Florida the place it is today. 9 of the sites are open to the public. They're in roadside locations and are accessible regardless of ability. One is part of an attraction that requires a ticket to enter. Let me know if you visited any of these in the comments. I love reading your comments and they help the channel. So let's look at 10 amazing Florida memorials as we bounce around the Sunshine State. Amazing Florida Memorial Number 1, World's Most Famous Dolphin. With apologies to one of my favorite Florida animals, Winter, the dolphin who lived at the Clearwater Marine Aquarium and starred in 2 movies, I'd argue that when it comes to famous dolphins, Winter is still second to Flipper, with 3 movies as well as a TV show. Known as Lassie in the Water, in the 1960s, Flipper was easily one of the most popular celebrities around, appearing in books and comics and on lunchboxes. The thing is, while Winter starred as herself, Flipper was a fictional character. While the posters didn't mention it, Flipper was portrayed by a remarkable dolphin named Mitzi, who lived in the Keys. While Flipper was a boy, Mitzi was a female. She was the favorite dolphin at Santini's Porpoise Training School on Grassy Key, and though she died in 1972, her memory lives on with this sculpture that marks her gravesite on the grounds of what is today Dolphin Research Center. Milton and Virginia Santini began their history with dolphins in the 1940s by capturing them in the water around the Keys and selling them to oceanariums. They opened their own facility to the public in 1958 and quickly became a popular stop on the road from Miami to Key West. While there were many dolphins that came and went at the attraction over the years, there was only one Mitzi. She would arrive at the facility in the late 50s. And Milton would break his back around the same time. Doctors had him squeeze a rubber ball as physical therapy, something he'd do while sitting beside the lagoon. One day, he accidentally dropped the ball into the water. To Milton's surprise, Mitzi took the ball in her mouth and flipped it back to him. Though she'd never played with a ball before, each time Milton tossed the ball in the water, Mitzi would play fetch. For the Santinis, this was the start of something big. They realized that after observing the behaviors of their dolphins, they could eventually teach them to repeat the behaviors when asked, primarily using hand and arm signs. The Santinis learned that positive reinforcement was key when a dolphin did a behavior after a prompt. While food is a common reinforcement, dolphins also respond to rubdowns and happy reactions from trainers. Mitzi would become the star of 2 movies, just as she was the star of Santini's Porpoise School. Other Santini dolphins would play parts in the movies as well. After her death, Milton was heartbroken and would sell the attraction. There's some confusion on various websites about whether Mitzi is buried at the facility, but Ali Proskovic, Dolphin Research Center's Director of Media and Marketing, assured me that Mitzi is buried near her memorial statue and a waterfall. Amazing Florida Memorial Number 2, Forgotten Orlando. It might not come as such a surprise that many people around the world think that Orlando means Disney World, and Disney World means Orlando. For people living in the city and the many communities surrounding it, Disney and the rest of the tourist area are in a specific place, and unless you work there, you can all but forget it's even there. The other side of the coin, however, is that many residents don't know the history of the Orlando area. Ask people how long ago the area was first settled, and you're unlikely to get an answer of 1843, but that's when the first white settlers moved there. A few years before that, in 1838, there was a number of Florida militia log forts that were built in central Florida, each about a day's march from the others. Fort Gatlin was the one built nearest to what is today downtown Orlando. It was named for John Gatlin, an Army doctor who was killed in Dade's massacre 3 years before in the skirmish that kicked off the Second Seminole War. Fort Gatlin was placed on the main north-south trail amidst several lakes. The fort never saw any action, as generally the Seminoles knew it would be foolish to attack a strong defensive position. This stone, placed at the junction of Gatlin and Summerlin Avenues in 1924, marks the general location of the old fort, which fell into disuse after 1939, though it was briefly used by the militia a few years later. Gatlin, like the rest of the small forts, had slash pine walls 15 feet or 4.5 meters tall and blockhouses on two opposite corners. It was about 6,000 feet or 560 meters square. Fort Christmas, shown here in East Orange County, is a recreation of such a garrison. Located a few blocks from the Gatlin marker is another small memorial. It also sits in front of a house, this time resting behind a mailbox. Placed there in 1970, it supposedly marks the location of a majestic oak tree that was known to be the meeting place of Seminole chiefs during the Second Seminole War. Yes, the war in which Fort Gatlin was in use about a half-mile away, though in the 1915 book Early Settlers of Orange County, Florida, it's noted that the councils were between the Seminoles and the military. It's unknown if the Orange County Historical Commission, who placed the marker, knew that this was the location of the old oak, and actually there's some circumstantial evidence that there were two large oaks in the general area that were used as meeting places. One seems to have been close to Fort Gatlin and the other further away, and might have been used in earlier times. It appears that by the time someone decided to write down information about the council oak, its existence had moved into legend, though we have reports that people remember seeing its dead trunk. While it's possible that the stories from two trees were conflated, it's likely the stories were from different times. Florida's original indigenous communities, and likewise the Seminoles, didn't settle in the Orlando area. They lived on the shores of larger rivers and along the coastline, where food was easy to collect and where transportation between places was simpler. That there was an oak, larger than the rest in this area, where people gathered for meetings, is certainly possible, and could be a place where two or more trails met. Additionally, while we don't have any direct evidence that Seminole leaders and the military met in council in the area, it's possible they did. These two unassuming markers are part of what is hidden Orlando, so much so that even most people who live there don't know they exist. Amazing Florida Memorial number 3, Labor Day Hurricane of 35. In 1912, Henry Flagler was one of the richest people in the world, being a founder of Standard Oil and a hotel and railroad developer. He turned St. Augustine, Ormond Beach, Daytona Beach, Palm Beach, and Miami into resorts for the wealthy. Beginning in 1885, he built his railroad from Jacksonville southward, reaching Miami in 1896. A few years later, he began to extend it to Key West, an endeavor that was quickly named Flagler's Folly. Yet by 1912, the 160-mile or 257-kilometer line had been completed, spanning 28 islands and 42 bridges. Flagler would see the railroad completed, even attending the celebration in Key West. While the Overseas Railroad wasn't a great commercial success, it quickly became a lifeline for Key residents who only had boats for transportation beforehand. It allowed tourism to develop, with sport fishing being the largest draw. The railroad operated into the 30s, though it required a great deal of maintenance. So in the midst of the Great Depression, the federal government sent hundreds of out-of-work World War I veterans to maintain the railroad infrastructure. Then on September 2nd, 1935, all hell broke loose. Although the Keys were under a hurricane warning, they had no idea of the strength of the incoming storm. It would make landfall in the Upper Keys as one of the strongest hurricanes to ever hit the U.S. Estimated sustained winds were 200 miles or 322 kilometers per hour. It remains the highest winds recorded in an Atlantic storm. It is also one of only two Cat 5 hurricanes to pummel Florida, along with Andrew in 1992. The Labor Day hurricane, as it became known, registered a storm surge of 20 feet or 6 meters that completely covered the Upper Keys. Portions of the Florida East Coast Railway were severely damaged or washed away. The settlements of Tavernier, Marathon, and Isla Mirada were obliterated, as were the work camps filled with veterans. Those camps had 695 men and weren't prepared for what was literally the storm of the century. The National Weather Service estimated that there were 408 deaths, including many of the veterans, though it's never been clear as to how many died. Some counts suggest as many as 485 people. Just 2 years later, this monument was dedicated, which is located on US 1 at mile marker 82 in Isla Mirada. Designed by the Florida Division of the Federal Art Project and built of local limestone, it was constructed by the Federal Works Progress Administration. The monument is a memorial to the veterans, locals, visitors, and railroad employees who lost their lives in the storm. It's 65 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a 12-foot-tall limestone shaft displaying a frieze depicting heavily bent palm trees, with fronds whipping in the wind amidst massive curling waves. In the front, there's a crypt dug into the bedrock that's covered by a 22-foot ceramic map of the Keys. The remains of about 300 people were placed in the crypt. Mostly ashes from makeshift funeral pyres in 12 locations due to the rapid decomposition of the dead and no easy way to transport them to proper morgues. In 1937, 4,000 people from the Keys and elsewhere came to Isla Mirada for the dedication ceremony. The monument was added to the U.S. National Register of Historic Places on March 16, 1995. Nearby, at mile marker 73, there are piers in the bay that also serve as a memorial to the fallen. While the Keys have been hit by many tropical storms, none have been as intense as the 1935 Labor Day hurricane. Amazing Florida Memorial Number 4, Greenvilles Favorite Sun. Greenville is a small town with about 750 residents in Madison County. Greenville sits on US 90, the old main route between Jacksonville and Tallahassee, and it remains a prettier drive than the nearby Interstate 10. In 1930, at the start of the Great Depression, the rural town was struggling, and it was in this climate that Ray Charles was born. His 15-year-old mother was from Greenville, but went to Albany, Georgia to be with relatives when it was time for Ray to be born. The two of them returned shortly after, and it was Greenville where he grew up. Around the age of 4, he started losing his sight, and by 7 he was completely blind, most likely due to glaucoma. The owner of the nearby Red Wing Cafe taught him to play piano. He'd be sent to St. Augustine to go to the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind between 1937 and 1945. His interest in music was fostered at the school, and by the time he left, he was good enough to earn some money playing in clubs. For 2 years, Ray would try to be a professional musician in Jacksonville, Orlando, and then Tampa. His next move was to Seattle, Washington, and by 1949, he had his first hit record, Confession Blues. The town of Greenville is rightfully proud of its residents, and commissioned a statue of Ray, which was unveiled in 2006 in Haffey Hayes Park. The life-size bronze sculpture was created by father and son team Bradley Cooley Sr. and Jr. The father passed away in 1978. Their studio is located in Lamont, only 18 miles or 29 kilometers away from Greenville. The Coolies created over 40 monumental sculptures, including ones of Otis Redding and Florida State University football coach Bobby Bowden. The Ray Charles statue was a result of a collaboration of the state of Florida and the town of Greenville, and the Coolies generously offered to create the statue for free. Concurrently, the town was able to purchase and restore the boyhood home of Ray, which is located only a few blocks away and is now a museum. Ray would release some 60 original albums in what was one of the most successful and remarkable music careers. He recorded albums for 55 years until his death in 2004 and charted on 5 of Billboard's charts: pop, country, R&B, jazz, and dance, selling 10 million albums. He was awarded 19 Grammys, including the Lifetime Achievement Award, and was part of the group that was the inaugural inductees into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Amazing Florida Memorial Number 5, the not-so-old Spanish Trail. Not surprisingly, St. Augustine is filled with historic memorials. For instance, check out this video I did on the city's earliest cemeteries. Of the many markers that memorialize important sites in St. Augustine, the memorial I'm sharing today is unusual since it's hidden in plain sight. Known as the Old Spanish Trail Zero Milestone, it's located next to the St. Augustine Visitor Information Center. Created in 1928, it commemorates the establishment of a coast-to-coast road system that's one of the oldest organized roads in the country. That's interesting, since St. Augustine is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the continental U.S., and most of its historical markers commemorate places or events that are hundreds of years old. It was originally claimed that the Old Spanish Trail followed the route used by Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century, but there wasn't a trail that connected California and Florida. Even between St. Augustine and Pensacola, the Spanish would travel by sea, as it was simply too difficult to go overland 400 miles or 644 kilometers. When I first encountered the milestone years ago, I assumed it was talking about an actual Spanish trail, not a modern road, and I'm sure most people think the same thing. The trail ran between San Diego and St. Augustine, with work beginning in 1915. There are 3 markers for the trail. The San Diego marker reads, Pacific Milestone, dedicated by our beloved President Calvin Coolidge, 1923. While in San Antonio, Texas Governor Pat Neff dedicated the marker beside the City Hall in 1924. To me, that stone resembles a potato, which I guess is appropriate since it's a New World vegetable. The St. Augustine milestone is a large ball of mortared coquina blocks, the same rock of which the Castillo is built. It's unclear if the sphere is solid or not, but it is clear that Florida got the best-looking marker. The Visitor Center says on its website that the milestone was erected in 1928 on the north side of the center, facing Castillo Drive. That places it on the opposite side of where it is today, as can be seen in this 1969 map. This map shows it still there in 1977, but subsequent maps in the archive fail to show it at all. But the north side isn't where it was first placed. This 1939 map shows the milestone was across from the entrance to the Castillo. Just like this one from 1954. By 1960, it had been moved closer to the Matanzas River, as it is in 64. But by 1969, it was at the Visitor Center. Today, while it's visible from the street, I doubt many people notice it, and that's a shame. It's a curious part of St. Augustine, and I think a sign should be posted to explain it better. There's another reason why I wish people would take a look at the Old Spanish Trail milestone. There's another unusual monument very close by. This fountain, adorned by a set of masks, was presented to the city in 2005 by its sister city, Avila, Spain, that was the birthplace of Pedro Menendez, the founder of St. Augustine. It's a reproduction of a fountain which was built in the 1600s in the Spanish city. It's known as the Fuente de los Caños de San Francisco, or the Fountain of the Spouts. It's located next to the Ferrara Palace and is one of the city's most renowned landmarks. The fountains share 6 somewhat comical human heads that emerge from the back with water spouting from their mouths. The water pours into a rectangular and oval basin. The original has 3 heraldic shields of the coats of arms of Avila and the Kingdom of Castile. St. Augustine's version is unheralded and made up of coquina, just like the milestone. St. Augustine and Avila have close ties, with Avila gifting the casket and headboard of Pedro Menendez in the 1920s, while in 1999, St. Augustine donated the anchor of the 17th century treasure ship Nuestra Senora de Atocha to the Philip Cousteau Anchor Museum near Avila. Both the Fountain of the Spouts and the Old Spanish Trail milestone would benefit from being placed in a more public area. Then again, it's a shady and quiet spot in a very busy city, and I like that. Amazing Florida Memorial Number 6. Indian Shores' First Inhabitants. Indian Shores is a small town located on Sand Key, one of the narrow barrier islands that line the Pinellas County shoreline. The town is one of the smallest in the state in size, being only 384 acres or 1.6 square kilometers. Like the rest of the towns along Sand Key and the other islands, its economy is based in Gulf Beach tourism. About midway along Gulf Boulevard in the town sits the Tiki Gardens Beach Access Site, the only public parking in Indian Shores. It's called Tiki Gardens after the early attraction that operated on the site between 1950 and 1990. Developed as a South Seas themed gardens and gift shop, it presented a mishmash of imagined Polynesian and Melanesian cultural cliches, popular in the 50s and 60s. Once Tiki Gardens closed, the town returned part of the property back to mangrove areas along the water. In mid-2021, a new construction project began at the north end of the Tiki Gardens site, and about a year later, in June 2022, this new monument was unveiled by the town. Featuring a small plaza with an informational arch and signs, a sundial, benches, and a bronze sculpture depicting 3 adult individuals, one holding a baby. The sculpture's design is based on the town's logo. The memorial honors the indigenous Tocobaga chiefdom that occupied the northern and western Tampa Bay area before and after the arrival of the Spanish. While Spain claimed the entire Florida peninsula as part of its empire, they never spent much time in the Tampa Bay area and had only limited contact with the Tocobaga. Nevertheless, within 200 years, they and the rest of the indigenous communities in the region had vanished due to introduced European diseases and raids by indigenous groups from the north. Geza Gaspar is the artist of the beautiful figurative sculpture. Gaspar is a Hungarian sculptor born in Romania. He has studios in Sarasota and Budapest, Hungary, and has created many life-size public artworks. When I communicated with Gaspar, he said that the project of the indigenous family was very exciting for me, and I happily accepted the invitation of Indian Shores to execute it. I felt that there are so many connections between my ancestral Hungarian traditions and the native Indian ones. The past should not be forgotten. Nations should keep their identities and promote their traditions to the next generations. The customs of spiritual life and love for nature, the way they cared for and nurtured the landscape in which they had lived. It was very similar between the two people. He went on to say, I was absolutely fascinated by their culture and spiritual habits, and I can honestly say that it was a huge honor for me to be part of this project. At the same time that Gaspar created this statue, he was working on 2 other commissions in the Tampa area. this statue of Benjamin Moody, the founder of Riverview, and this cyclist located in a nearby Hawkstone community. Amazing Florida Memorial Number 7, Florida Southern College's architect. When you think of Frank Lloyd Wright, the 20th century's most famous architect, Florida isn't a state that comes to mind. In nearly all documentaries on his life, his work in the state only gets passing mention. But as to which place represents the best of his work, by sheer numbers, no city tops Lakeland, where you'll find the largest single-site concentration of Wright structures. Here there are 12 buildings, all of which are part of the same project, known as Child of the Sun. This remarkable project is also the only major work he did for a college. Making up a large portion of the campus of Florida Southern College, it's located on the shore of Lake Hollingsworth in the midst of a residential neighborhood. This statue of Wright overlooks part of the campus from across Frank Lloyd Wright Way. It's on the property of Sharp Family Tourism and Education Center, which has a Wright-designed Usonian house that was built in 2013. The house design was created in 1939, but the 14 planned houses on campus were never built. The property also features a refurbished house that is now offices and a gift shop. The statue is located on a patio between the two buildings and was created by sculptors Don Hogan and Tina Stern Hogan. The Hogans live in Atlanta and have created many remarkable sculptures on display in the U.S. Built between 1938 and 58, the Child of the Sun, like so much of Wright's works, included experimental techniques and materials, most of which have withstood the test of time. One particularly intriguing aspect to the early construction is that the college's faculty and students were part of the work crews. Because of the Great Depression, students were offered a work scholarship program where students would work 3 days and attend classes 3 days each week. Much of the work was construction work, as you can see in these photos. During World War II, most of the male students enlisted in the military, which left the college populated mostly by women. Because so many construction workers also enlisted, it fell upon female students to swell the ranks of those building Wright's projects. The legacy of the Child of the Sun is due as much to them as it is to Wright. Wright explained the importance of the project in 1953, stating, "About 15 years ago, when Dr. Spivey, the presidential good genius of Florida Southern College, flew north to Taliesin, he came with the express purpose of giving the U.S. one example of a college wherein modern life was to have the advantages of modern science and art in actual building construction. He said he wanted me as much for my philosophy as for my architecture. I assured him they were inseparable. You can't really know very much about anything America has in native culture worth knowing unless you study them. The path we call organic architecture is along the center line of an indigenous culture for these states, because there can be no great life for our people without the integral culture of an architecture of our own. If you try to understand these buildings and know what they are all about, something important to our country's future as a democratic nation will transpire. You will see the sentiment of a true educational saga along the cultural lines of indigenous architecture for our own country." Amazing Florida Memorial Number 8, Mercury 7. The only memorial here not generally accessible to the public is a 13-foot-tall stainless steel statue that combines the symbol for Mercury and the number 7. The symbol is a form of the caduceus, a staff intertwined with 2 serpents that represented the Greek and Roman deities Hermes and Mercury. The cross on the bottom of the caduceus was added in the Middle Ages to Christianize it. The memorial sits on the property of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station at Launch Complex 14. The access to the area is restricted since an adjacent launch complex is in use by SpaceX. The monument was dedicated in 1964 and is one of several memorials commemorating Project Mercury and the 4 crewed Mercury missions launched from there. For more information on the early days of U.S. space exploration, see this video exploring the history of the Cape. Apart from Mercury 7 symbol, the memorial is comprised of a concrete pad with two plaques. One is circular and is a relief of the astronauts. The other is rectangular and includes a quote from President John Kennedy. One of the most complex tasks ever presented to man in this country, the achievement of manned flight in orbit around the Earth. It also includes a mathematical formula, which was used to find out the speed NASA needed their rockets to go to enter orbit around the Earth. It's this plaque which rests on top of a hidden cavity. Inside, NASA placed a time capsule. The items were sealed within special plastic containers and included photos from Project Mercury, reports from the early days of the program, summaries of the flights, the 1962 book We 7 by the astronauts themselves, a deck of General Dynamics astronautics space cards, Friendship 7, a color movie documenting the flight of John Glenn, voice countdown excerpts, and a desk model of an Atlas Mercury vehicle at 1/65th scale. It's also thought that the time capsule includes John Glenn's naval aviator wings, though I haven't been able to confirm that, and I've seen them called Marine Corps pilot wings, which don't exist. The time capsule was in the planning stages prior to President Kennedy's assassination in 1963, and it was he who requested that it be opened in 500 years, hence in 2464. It's a shame the memorial can't be viewed currently. It was a regular stopping point on earlier bus tours of the Cape, and of course it serves as a visible reminder of the early days of space exploration to the people who work on today's space missions, including returning humans to the moon. Amazing Florida Memorial Number 9, Florida's first U.S. Senator. David Levy Yulee is, like so many of Florida's early developers, a polarizing figure. He and his family, including his father Moses Levy, were some of the first people to move into Florida after Spain ceded it to the U.S. He owned a 5,000-acre sugarcane plantation and founded the Florida Railroad Company. He'd be elected to the Florida Territorial Legislative Council, be a delegate to the territory's Constitutional Convention, be the Florida Territorial Delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives, and once Florida became a state, be the first Floridian and the first Jewish person elected to the U.S. Senate. As such, he made significant contributions to the development of Florida. Yet, he and his family derived their business success and wealth from hundreds of individuals they enslaved, and he worked to encourage the expansion of slavery. He also resigned from the Senate to join the Confederacy at the start of the Civil War. In Fernandina Beach, the third oldest continuously inhabited city in Florida, the residents chose to memorialize Yulee for his work before and after the war as an early railroad developer. Living in Fernandina, he began planning to develop a railroad. It was chartered in 1853 and, making use of federal and state land grants and the financial credit they afforded him, was able to raise the capital needed. The eastern terminus was located near Fernandina, and the inhabitants of the town, fearing a rival town would be developed, moved Fernandina a mile to where the town sits today. The western terminus was Cedar Key, a small island on the Gulf, 160 miles or 257 kilometers from Fernandina. Both locations had deep water ports to allow for cargo ships to connect with the cross-state railroad. The Florida Railroad Company began work on the line in 1855, using a combination of slaves and Irish immigrants as laborers. The complicated project was completed in 1861, shortly before the outbreak of the Civil War. After the war, Yulee was imprisoned for 9 months on a charge of treason for his involvement in Confederacy President Jefferson Davis's attempted escape from Union forces. But that's a story for another time. Yulee would receive a pardon, and upon his return to Fernandina, he undertook the process of rebuilding the mostly destroyed railroad. He concurrently would manage and operate 3 other railroad companies in the state, which earned him the title Father of Florida Railroads. A bronze David Levy Yulee sits on a bench in front of the restored Fernandina Rail Depot near the Amelia River. The statue is by Susan Lurie, an accomplished sculptor who is originally from Baltimore but currently lives in South Florida. She has numerous sculptures on display throughout the U.S. and Italy, including ones depicting Babe Ruth and a young George Washington. While Yulee is an important figure in the development of Florida once it became part of the U.S., Lurie chose not to place him in some sort of exalted pose. Speaking about her collaboration with the Fernandina Beach Committee, Lurie shared in an interview with me that they had lots of talks about it, and we didn't want to put him up on a pedestal. That's a whole different thing. This man lived here, and he accomplished many things. He was the first Jewish senator. He lobbied hard for Florida to become a state. We wanted to make him accessible and have people get a look at him, not just walk by and say, "Oh, there's just another monument of a guy up on a pedestal." Lurie further commented that she chose to portray him as holding his watch and having his carpet bag next to him with the maps in it of the state that he was going to cross with his train. I love researching things like that, so that's what caught my attention, the challenge. Susan Lurie is currently working on a project in the U.S. Virgin Islands. As she puts it, "I've been working for 10 years on doing a sculpture in the Caribbean that honors the women who worked in the coal industry after they were freed from working as slaves and had no other way of making money." Beyond this memorial statue in Fernandina Beach, the town which moved itself due to his influence, Yulee is also remembered in the names of a town and a county. Levy County is on the Gulf Coast and contains Cedar Key, while the town of Yulee sits just a few miles to the west of Fernandina. Amazing Florida Memorial Number 10, The Sponge Divers. There's 1,000 unique cities in Florida, which in a way makes Tarpon Springs fairly normal. Yet when you walk down Dodecanese Boulevard, you might get the impression that you're in a village somewhere in the Greek islands. That's not surprising when you realize that around 3,000 of the residents of the small city are descendants of Greek immigrants who first arrived 120 years ago. For more info on Tarpon's early years, check out this video. Those families were enticed to the 29-mile-long Anclote River for one simple reason: sponges. They increased the population by 300% between 1900 and 1910, and they retained their ancient culture to the point that when the sponges stopped being plentiful, many residents switched to tourism, making Tarpon Springs the most Greek city in America. Dodecanese Boulevard runs along the Anclote, which is still a busy commercial fishing and shrimping port, and in 2002, the city placed this statue here, where sponge boats float on the river in the background. It depicts a young sponge diver in a traditional diving suit with a helmet in one arm. This uniform, known as a standard diving dress, was developed in the 1830s and made deep water diving possible, including the collecting of sponges at depths of more than 100 feet or 30 meters. Unlike the self-contained scuba diving apparatus invented in the 1940s, the standard diving dress requires an air line leading from the surface of the water, which pumps air down to the diver. The statue is labeled in memory of the spongers of Tarpon Springs. Despite the heavy copper or brass helmet, weighted boots, and waterproof canvas suit, standard diving dress had limitations. The reliance on surface air restricted a diver's mobility and depth capabilities, as lengthy decompression times were necessary to avoid decompression sickness. The bulkiness and weight of the suit posed challenges for divers, making it physically demanding to work underwater, plus there was always the risk of the complicated equipment failing. Because of the risks, thousands of spongers were injured or killed throughout the world. By the way, there's another sponge diver statue in Tarpon Springs that's been there since the late 60s. It's made of fiberglass, wears standard diving dress, and sports a distinctive mustache. It's also located on Dodecanese Boulevard, this time in front of the Aegean Bar and Grill, which was once known as the Papas restaurant. There are so many more monuments and memorials around the state, and all of them have far deeper stories than are shared in the couple paragraphs typically placed on markers. Even in the few minutes I've spent with these 10 today, I've only scratched a little bit below the surface. Please check out my other videos, most of which do go deeper and pull out the fascinating aspects of Florida's history. Thank you for watching another of my videos. If you learned something, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to learn more about Florida's tourism history. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.